January 13th, 1968. A cold Saturday morning in Northern California. Inside the cafeteria of Folsom State Prison, 1,000 convicted felons sit waiting. Armed guards line the walkways above. The warden has made it clear. No standing, no sudden movements. Then, dressed entirely in black, a man walks onto a small stage set up between the dining tables. His voice is deep, weathered by years of pills and whiskey. He's Johnny Cash, and he hasn't had a #1 hit in 5 years. His career is dying. His record label thinks this prison concert is a waste of time. Cash grabs the microphone. "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," he says. The room explodes. What happens next will be recorded on mobile equipment brought in by Columbia Records. The album that results, at Folsom Prison, will sell over 3 million copies. It will hit #1 on the country charts and crack the top 15 on the pop charts. It will make Johnny Cash a household name again and transform him from fading country star to cultural icon. But more than that, this album will become a rallying cry for prison reform, a bridge between country music and the counterculture, and one of the most influential live recordings in American music history. This is the story of how a desperate gamble behind prison walls became the comeback that saved Johnny Cash's life and changed country music forever. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Johnny Cash's. To understand why Johnny Cash needed Folsom Prison, you have to understand how far he had fallen. The early 1960s had been Cash's golden era. He had scored massive hits with songs that crossed over from country to pop. Ring of Fire, I Walk the Line, Understand Your Man. These weren't just country songs. They were American anthems, beloved by fans from Memphis to Manhattan. But success came with demons. Cash had developed an addiction to amphetamines and barbiturates that would nearly kill him. The pills started innocently enough. Uppers to keep him going through grueling tour schedules, downers to help him sleep. By the mid-1960s, he was consuming handfuls of pills daily. His behavior became erratic. He missed concerts or showed up too intoxicated to perform. His first marriage to Vivian Liberto crumbled under the weight of his addiction and constant touring. He was arrested multiple times, caught smuggling pills across the Mexican border, detained for picking flowers in someone's yard while high, spending nights in local jails to dry out. The tabloids loved it. Johnny Cash, the man in black, living up to his outlaw image. But the music industry was less forgiving. By 1967, Cash's record sales had plummeted. His last top 40 hit had been Understand Your Man in 1964, 3 long years ago. Radio stations weren't playing his new singles. Concert promoters were wary of booking him. Even his own record label, Columbia Records, had lost faith. W.S. Fluke. Holland, Cash's longtime drummer, remembers those dark days with clarity. The band couldn't get Cash into a studio. He was too unpredictable, too consumed by his addictions. The golden boy of country music was becoming a cautionary tale. But in late 1967, something shifted. Cash met with June Carter, his duet partner, his touring companion, and the woman who would become his second wife. June came from country music royalty, the Carter family, and she saw something in Cash worth saving. She helped him get into treatment. She stood by him through the tremors and the sweats of withdrawal. By the end of 1967, Cash was getting clean. Not perfect. He would struggle with sobriety for years, but functional. Clear-headed enough to realize his career was in crisis. Desperate enough to try something radical. That's when he pitched the Folsom Prison idea. Johnny Cash's connection to prisons began long before his career troubles. In 1951, while serving in the United States Air Force Security Service in West Germany, Cash's unit watched a movie during their downtime. The film was called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison, a gritty 1951 crime drama directed by Crane Wilbur. The movie depicted the harsh realities of prison life at California's notorious Folsom State Prison. Something about it struck Cash deeply. Years later, he would say the film moved him, made him think about the men trapped inside those walls, living without hope. Sitting in that Air Force theater in Germany, Cash picked up his pen. He wanted to capture what he imagined prison felt like. The claustrophobia, the regret, the endless passage of time. The result was Folsom Prison Blues, written in 1953. The song contains one of the most famous lines in country music history. "But I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." When asked years later by photographer Jim Marshall why the narrator was imprisoned in Folsom when the murder happened in Reno, Nevada, Cash responded simply, "That's called poetic license." Cash has admitted he was trying to think of the worst possible reason someone could have for killing another person. The senselessness of it. Murder as sport, as curiosity, made the song's narrator truly irredeemable. And yet, Cash sang it with such empathy that listeners couldn't help but feel for the condemned man. Folsom Prison Blues became Cash's second single on Sun Records in 1955. By early 1956, it had climbed to number 4 on the Billboard Country and Western Bestsellers chart. The song resonated not just with regular listeners but with inmates themselves. Letters started arriving at Cash's management office. Prisoners from across America writing to say how much the song meant to them, how it captured their experience, how they felt like Johnny Cash understood them in a way no one else did. They asked him to come perform at their prisons. In 1957, Cash played his first prison concert at Huntsville State Prison in Texas. He was nervous, unsure how it would go. But when he walked out and started singing, the response overwhelmed him. These men, society's outcasts, the forgotten, gave him the most enthusiastic reception he'd ever received. Cash played more prison shows over the next decade: San Quentin in 1958, Folsom in November 1966. Each time he felt that same connection, that same raw appreciation. One thing he liked about playing prisons, his drummer Fluke Holland later recalled with dark humor, if he did something the audience didn't like, they couldn't leave. But it was more than that. Cash genuinely cared about these men. His daughter Tara Cash Schwabel explained her father's motivation. It really spoke to his rebellious side. He had a passion for just standing up for these people who were locked up and treated so poorly. Cash himself never served hard time. Despite his outlaw image, his jail stays were limited to occasional nights sobering up after minor offenses. But he saw himself in these prisoners. He understood what it meant to be judged, to be written off, to fight demons that society didn't want to acknowledge. In late 1967, with his career in freefall and his sobriety fragile, Cash had an idea. What if he recorded a live album at a prison? Columbia Records thought Cash had lost his mind. A live album? Recorded in a prison? With an audience of convicted criminals? Who would buy such a thing? The label executives had a point. Live albums in 1967 were rare and risky. Prison-themed content was controversial. And Cash's recent commercial failures made any investment in him seem like throwing money away. Columbia was focused on promoting pop stars, not reviving the careers of fading country singers with drug problems. But Cash had one crucial ally: Bob Johnston. Johnston had just been brought in to run the country division at Columbia Records after a major personnel shakeup. The label had ousted Frank Jones and Don Law, who had produced several of Cash's previous albums, in favor of this newcomer known for his erratic behavior and willingness to fight studio executives. Johnston was also Bob Dylan's producer, the man behind Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. He understood artists who didn't fit into neat commercial boxes. When Cash pitched him the prison album concept, Johnston didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," he said. Johnston made calls to 2 California prisons: San Quentin State Prison and Folsom State Prison. Folsom responded first. They would allow the recording. The date was set, January 13, 1968. Cash assembled his crew. His longtime backing band, the Tennessee Three, guitarist Luther Perkins, bassist Marshall Grant, and drummer Fluke Holland. Rockabilly legend Carl Perkins on additional guitar. The Statler brothers providing backing vocals. And June Carter, who would perform several duets with Cash. They also brought Reverend Floyd Gressett, pastor of Avenue Community Church in Ventura, California, where Cash often attended services. Gressett had been counseling inmates at Folsom and helped facilitate the concert. His presence would prove crucial in ways no one expected. On January 10, 1968, Cash and June Carter checked into the El Rancho Motel in Sacramento. Over the next 2 days, they rehearsed intensely. This was unusual. Cash's band typically didn't rehearse much before shows. But this performance mattered. Cash needed it to work. The night before the concert, on January 12th, something extraordinary happened. The band was rehearsing in their hotel when Reverend Gressett arrived with a cassette tape. An inmate at Folsom named Glen Sherley had written a song about the prison's chapel and recorded it with help from the prison's recreational director. Gressett thought Cash might want to hear it. Jean Belay, a young reporter from the Ventura Star Free Press who was covering the event, watched what happened next. Cash asked if anyone had a tape recorder. Belay raised his hand. They played the tape. The song was called Greystone Chapel, a 3-chord gospel tune about finding redemption inside prison walls. Shirley's voice, deep like Cash's own, boomed from the small recorder. "Inside the walls of prison, my body may be, but my Lord has set my soul free." Cash listened once, then he said, "I want to record it." He stayed up most of the night learning the song, scribbling down the lyrics, working out the arrangement with his band. No one told Glen Sherley. The inmate serving time for armed robbery had no idea his song had reached Johnny Cash, let alone that it would be performed the next day. Also that night, California Governor Ronald Reagan, staying at the same hotel for an after-dinner speech, stopped by to visit the band and offer his encouragement. Even Reagan, who would later campaign on tough-on-crime policies, recognized something special was about to happen. The next morning, January 13, 1968, Cash and his entourage traveled from Sacramento to Folsom State Prison, about 30 miles northeast. Columbia Records photographer Jim Marshall and Los Angeles Times writer Robert Hilburn came along to document the event. Folsom Prison had opened in 1880, making it one of California's oldest prisons. By 1968, it housed over 2,000 inmates in a granite fortress that looked like something from the 19th century. This was a maximum security facility. Murderers, robbers, rapists, California's most dangerous criminals. The prison agreed to let Cash perform 2 shows, one at 9:40 a.m. and another at 12:40 p.m. in case the first one didn't work out. Each audience would consist of about 1,000 inmates crammed into the prison cafeteria, mess hall number 2. Guards lined the walkways above with rifles. The warden made the rules clear. Inmates must stay seated. No standing, no sudden movements. An MC named Hugh Cherry was assigned to warm up the crowd. He encouraged the prisoners to respond to Cash's performance, to cheer, to clap, to make noise. This was being recorded after all. They wanted it to sound alive. At 9:40 a.m., Carl Perkins walked out and performed Blue Suede Shoes to get the crowd energized. Then Johnny Cash stepped onto the small stage. Those 4 words, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," have become one of the most iconic openings in music history. The prisoners erupted. 1,000 men, many serving long sentences with little hope of release, screaming and cheering for the man in black. The raw fluorescent lights of the prison cafeteria cast harsh shadows. Cigarette smoke filled the air. Armed guards watched from above. And Johnny Cash grinned. He immediately launched into Folsom Prison Blues, the song that had brought him here. The inmates knew every word. They had lived this song. Interestingly, during the actual performance, the prisoners stayed relatively quiet during the verses, careful not to give the guards any reason to shut down the concert. The explosive cheers heard on the final album at the famous line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," were actually enhanced in post-production. But the energy was real. Gene Belay, watching from the side, had never seen anything like it. All the guys screaming and hollering and hooting and whistling. I had never been to another show that had those kind of reactions. Cash moved through his setlist with confidence. He performed Dark as a Dungeon, a mining song that spoke to the experience of men trapped underground, or behind bars. When a prisoner laughed at something during the song, Cash chuckled too. The ice was broken. He started talking directly to the inmates, not performing at them but with them. At one point, Cash told the crowd, "I just wanted to tell you that this show is being recorded for an album released on Columbia Records, so you can't say hell or shit or anything like that." The line stayed on the final album. Columbia knew gold when they heard it. Cash performed songs specifically chosen for this audience. 25 Minutes to Go, a darkly comic tune about a man counting down to his execution. Cocaine Blues, where Cash chuckled his way through lyrics about drug-fueled violence and getting arrested. When I was arrested, I was dressed in black. The self-referential humor wasn't lost on anyone. He sang Long Black Veil, a mournful ballad about a man executed for a murder he didn't commit. The Wall, about a prisoner who tries to escape and dies. These weren't pop confections. They were raw, dark explorations of guilt, punishment, and death. June Carter joined him for Jackson, their playful duet about a married couple's quarrel, bringing a moment of lightness. She stayed for Give My Love to Rose, a heartbreaking story of a dying drifter asking someone to tell his family he loved them. But the real moment, the one that would define the entire album, came at the end. Cash looked out into the crowd. He spotted Glen Sherley sitting in the front row, the prisoner who had written the song Cash learned just hours before. "This next song was written by a man right here in Folsom Prison," Cash announced. "And last night was the first time I've ever sung this song. Anyway, this song was written by our friend Glen Sherley." The cafeteria exploded. 800 inmates went wild, cheering for one of their own. Sherley, who had no idea this was coming, sat in stunned disbelief. Cash launched into Greystone Chapel. "Inside the walls of prison, my body may be, but my Lord has set my soul free. There's a Greystone Chapel here at Folsom, a house of worship in this den of sin. You wouldn't think that God had a place here at Folsom, but he saved the soul of many lost men." The prisoners listened in reverent silence. This wasn't just a song. This was their story, sung by someone who understood. When it ended, the applause was thunderous. After the performance, Cash got permission from the warden to meet Shirley backstage. The two men connected immediately. Both saw elements of themselves in each other. Both understood addiction, struggle, the feeling of being society's outcast. The second show at 12:40 p.m. was good, but not as electric. The performers were tired. The magic of the first performance couldn't be replicated. Only 2 songs from the second show, Give My Love to Rose and an impromptu version of I Got Stripes, made it onto the final album. Cash and his crew left Folsom that day exhausted and uncertain. They had recorded something powerful, but would anyone care? Fluke Holland, Cash's drummer, was skeptical. "I told everybody it won't sell enough to pay for the expense of going out with the recording equipment. That shows how wrong I was." Bob Johnston had 4 months to turn the raw prison recordings into a commercial album. Columbia Records, still unconvinced the project would succeed, invested minimal resources in promotion. The label was focused on pop acts. A live country album recorded in a prison? That seemed like a niche product at best. The album's release was prepared quickly. Producer Bob Johnston mixed the tracks, deliberately emphasizing the prisoners' reactions to create an immersive experience. He wanted listeners to feel like they were in that cafeteria, surrounded by convicted felons, experiencing the raw connection between performer and audience. At Folsom Prison was released on May 6, 1968. The single, the live version of Folsom Prison Blues, hit the Billboard Hot 100 on May 25th, just 3 weeks after the album's release. It entered the country charts a week later. Early sales were promising. But then something unexpected happened that nearly derailed everything. On June 5, 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The nation was still reeling from the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. just 2 months earlier. Violence seemed to be consuming America. Radio stations across the country started pulling Folsom Prison Blues from their playlists. The reason? That infamous line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." In the wake of 2 high-profile political assassinations, the song's casual violence felt inappropriate, even dangerous. Program directors didn't want to explain why they were playing a song celebrating murder. Columbia Records panicked. The label demanded Bob Johnston remix the single with the controversial line removed. Cash protested. Removing that line gutted the song's power. But Columbia's marketing department insisted. A censored version was rush-released, with the Reno line edited out or buried in the mix. And then something remarkable happened. The censored version became a smash hit. The single climbed to #1 on the country charts. It cracked the top 40 on the pop charts, Cash's first pop chart success in years. The album followed, hitting #1 on the top country albums chart and reaching #13 on the pop albums chart. By August 1968, At Folsom Prison had shipped more than 300,000 copies. In October, just 5 months after release, it was certified gold for shipping over 500,000 copies. The album wasn't just selling to country fans. Pop audiences, rock fans, folk enthusiasts, everyone was buying it. The counterculture embraced it as an anti-establishment statement. Conservative audiences saw it as tough-on-crime reality. Everyone heard what they wanted to hear. Critics were equally enthusiastic. Al Aronovitz of Life magazine wrote that Cash sang the songs like, "Someone who has grown up believing he is one of the people that these songs are about." Ann Fisher of The Village Voice declared that every cut is special in its own way. Richard Goldstein praised the album as filled with the kind of emotionalism you seldom find in rock. By the end of 1968, At Folsom Prison had become one of the top-selling albums of the year, trailing only Iron Butterfly's In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida and the Beatles' White Album. It would eventually sell over 3 million copies in the United States alone, earning triple platinum certification in 2003. The album that Columbia Records had barely supported, that Cash recorded as a desperate attempt to save his dying career, had become a cultural phenomenon. The success of At Folsom Prison didn't just revive Johnny Cash's career, it completely transformed it. Before Folsom, Cash was playing county fairs and small venues, lucky to get a booking. After Folsom, he was selling out Madison Square Garden and the Los Angeles Forum. He went from regional country star to international icon. In 1969, Cash recorded a follow-up live album at San Quentin State Prison. At San Quentin became an even bigger commercial success than Folsom, hitting #1 on both the country and pop charts. The single A Boy Named Sue became Cash's biggest pop hit ever. ABC television offered Cash his own variety show. The Johnny Cash Show debuted in June 1969, taped at the legendary Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. For 2 years, Cash hosted everyone from Bob Dylan to Louis Armstrong, from Joni Mitchell to Ray Charles. He used the platform to champion causes he cared about: prison reform, Native American rights, opposition to the Vietnam War. Cash was no longer just a country singer. He had become a voice for the disenfranchised, a bridge between conservative Middle America and the counterculture. Conservatives admired his patriotism and law and order image. Liberals respected his advocacy for prisoners and social justice. He could walk into the Nixon White House and play protest songs to the president's face. He could testify before Congress about prison reform. He could sell millions of records while openly criticizing America's criminal justice system. On July 26, 1972, Cash testified before the Senate Subcommittee on National Penitentiaries, advocating for rehabilitation over punishment. His words were powerful and personal. "I have seen and heard of things at some of the concerts that would chill the blood of the average citizen, but I think possibly the blood of the average citizen needs to be chilled in order for public apathy and conviction to come about, because right now we have 1972 problems and 1872 jails. People have got to care in order for prison reform to come about." He continued, "A first offender needs to know that somebody cares for him and that he is given a fair shake. The purpose behind prison reform should be to have less crime. The prisoner has to be treated like a human being. If he isn't when he gets out, he won't act like one." That same day, Cash met with President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. Nixon, hoping for a photo op and some easy publicity, asked Cash to perform a few songs. He specifically requested "Okie from Muskogee" by Merle Haggard and "Welfare Cadillac" by Guy Drake, both right-wing anthems. Cash's response was deadpan. "I don't know those songs, but I got a few of my own I can play for you." With the press watching, Cash performed 3 pointed songs: "What is Truth?", an anti-war anthem celebrating youth protest; "Man in Black," explaining his solidarity with the poor and imprisoned; and "The Ballad of Ira Hayes," about the mistreatment of Native Americans. Nixon sat through it all, reportedly uncomfortable but unable to walk out. Cash later said the president was really kind and charming with us, and he seemed to be honestly enjoying himself. But the message had been delivered. Johnny Cash wouldn't be co-opted. In his 1971 song "Man in Black," Cash explained his trademark all-black wardrobe. "I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down, living in the hopeless, hungry side of town. I wear it for the prisoner who has long paid for his crime, but is there because he's a victim of the times." The Folsom Prison performance had given Cash more than commercial success. It had given him purpose, a platform, a mission. He would record 2 more prison albums: "På Österåker" at a Swedish prison in 1973, and "A Concert Behind Prison Walls" at Tennessee State Prison in 1976. He would continue performing at prisons for the rest of his career. At least 30 prison concerts in total, most of them unpaid. He did it because inmates wrote him letters, because they told him his music helped them survive, because he genuinely believed they deserved compassion and a second chance. The success of At Folsom Prison should have been Glen Sherley's redemption story. Instead, it became his tragedy. After the concert, Cash didn't forget the inmate who had written Greystone Chapel. As Cash's star rose, he advocated for Shirley's release. He promised the prisoner a job in Nashville, a chance at a new life. In 1971, with help from Cash's lobbying and personal guarantee to Governor Ronald Reagan, Glen Sherley was paroled. Johnny Cash met him at the prison gates, a moment that seemed to validate everything Cash had been saying about redemption and second chances. 2 weeks after Shirley's release, his album Glen Sherley Live at Vacaville was released by Mega Records. Cash had arranged for it to be recorded with top Nashville session musicians at Vacaville Prison, where Sherley had been transferred before his release. Cash promoted the album on his TV show. Sherley moved to Nashville. He married Nikki Robbins, an employee at Cash's publishing company, House of Cash. Johnny Cash was his best man. As a wedding present, Cash flew in Shirley's 2 children from his previous marriage to attend the ceremony. Shirley wrote songs for Cash's publishing house. He performed on Cash's touring show. He testified before Congress on prison reform alongside his famous benefactor. He appeared in a documentary about prison reform shot at Tennessee State Prison. For a brief moment, Glen Sherley seemed to embody Cash's convictions about prisoners and redemption. Here was living proof that inmates could change, that society's outcasts deserved second chances. But the transition to civilian life proved impossible for Sherley to navigate. Country musician Marty Stewart later reflected, he came from having nothing, to being in a prison cell, to suddenly finding himself at the Los Angeles Forum in front of 17,000 people. That's a huge adjustment for anyone. Shirley's daughter Rhonda, now a retired Tennessee state trooper, remembered attending that Forum concert as a child. "I mean, I didn't see him down at Billy Bob's, I didn't see him at the church, I saw him at the Forum, all those people. First time I'd seen John and June play. That whole atmosphere, it was just, wow." But behind the scenes, Sherley was struggling. His criminal instincts didn't disappear. He had spent most of his adult life incarcerated. He didn't know how to function in normal society. The drugs and alcohol that had led to his crimes came back into his life. While on tour with Cash, Sherley made violent threats against members of the crew. Multiple people complained to Cash about feeling unsafe around Sherley. The man in black tried to help, tried to intervene, but finally had to make a painful decision. Johnny Cash fired Glen Sherley from his touring show and publishing company. Sherley's marriage fell apart. He became estranged from his children. He left Nashville and ended up working on a cattle ranch in California, living in the cab of his truck. His drinking spiraled out of control. His drug use resumed. In May 1978, while high on drugs, Glen Sherley shot a man. 2 days later, on May 11, 1978, hiding out at his brother's house in Gonzales, California, Glen Sherley put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. He was 42 years old. Johnny Cash volunteered to pay for the funeral. The man who had once performed Greystone Chapel in front of 800 cheering inmates was laid to rest in Shafter, California. Cash was devastated. His daughter Tara Cash Schwobel recalled, "It was a wake-up call that he realized he couldn't save everybody." On the day Cash heard about Sherley's suicide, he drew a picture in his journal, a bird flying away from a prison cell window. Beneath it he wrote words from Greystone Chapel. "The Lord has set my soul free." Keith Sherley, Glen's brother, was shown the journal entry years later by a Cash scholar. "I think John understood that released his soul, and that he was finally free from whatever demons that he had been dealing with." Glen Sherley's story complicated the narrative of At Folsom Prison. The album had represented hope, redemption, the possibility of transformation. Sherley's suicide suggested the limits of that hope, the reality that some demons are too deeply rooted to overcome. But it didn't change Cash's commitment. He continued advocating for prison reform, continued performing at prisons, continued believing that society's outcasts deserved compassion, even when individual redemption stories ended in tragedy. In 2003, the Recording Industry Association of America certified At Folsom Prison triple platinum for sales exceeding 3 million copies. That same year, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry, designating it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The library's citation explained the album's importance. At Folsom Prison followed a theme of the 1960s, social justice in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and others. It created awareness about prison conditions and sparked dialogue about rehabilitation versus punishment. The album has been included in virtually every greatest albums of all time list published since. Rolling Stone, Blender, Time Magazine, Country Music Television all recognize it as a landmark recording. But the album's influence extends beyond critical acclaim and sales figures. At Folsom Prison proved that live albums could be commercially viable and artistically significant. It demonstrated that authenticity could trump production polish. It showed that country music could tackle serious social issues while still entertaining. The album bridged divides. It brought country music to rock and folk audiences. It made prison reform acceptable dinner conversation in Middle America. It helped establish Cash as a crossover artist who could appear on both the Grand Ole Opry and Bob Dylan's albums. Most importantly, it gave voice to America's incarcerated population at a time when society preferred to forget they existed. Cash would say years later, "I think prison songs are popular because most of us are living in one kind of little prison or another. And whether we know it or not, the words of a song about someone who is actually in a prison speak for a lot of us who might appear not to be, but really are." The performances at prisons continued throughout Cash's career. Even in his final years when his health was failing, he would accept invitations to perform for inmates. He did it for free. He did it because their letters told him it mattered. When Cash died on September 12, 2003, obituaries around the world led with his Folsom Prison concert. That one performance, recorded on a cold January morning in 1968, had defined his legacy more than any other achievement. The city of Folsom embraced its connection to Cash. In 2014, the city unveiled the Johnny Cash Trail, over 3 miles of bike trail featuring 8 larger-than-life art installations telling Cash's story. Phase 1 of the trail was dedicated with a ceremony attended by Roseanne Cash, Johnny's daughter from his first marriage. In 2015, a new species of black tarantula discovered near Folsom Prison was named Aphonopelma johnnycashi in his honor, a fitting tribute to the man in black. Greystone Chapel still stands on the grounds of old Folsom State Prison, still used by various religious groups. Efforts continue to restore the chapel's historic artwork, including a replica of Da Vinci's The Last Supper, painted by an inmate in the 1930s. What made At Folsom Prison work when so many live albums fail? Part of it was timing. The album arrived in 1968, a year when America was tearing itself apart. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. Cities burned in race riots. Vietnam War protests turned violent. Young people were taking to the streets demanding change. In that context, Cash's message of compassion for society's outcasts resonated. His plea for prison reform aligned with a broader questioning of American institutions. His willingness to perform for convicted criminals seemed like an act of radical empathy. But more than timing, the album worked because of authenticity. You can hear it in every track. The rawness of the recording, no studio tricks, just mobile equipment capturing a moment. The genuine connection between performer and audience. Cash wasn't performing at these men, he was performing with them. The technical imperfections made it real. Guitar strings slightly out of tune. Cash's voice cracking on certain notes. The ambient noise of a prison cafeteria. Clanking metal, shuffling feet, distant echoes. Producer Bob Johnston wisely preserved these elements rather than cleaning them up in post-production. Cash's song selection revealed deep understanding of his audience. He didn't sanitize his material or avoid dark subjects. 25 minutes to go jokes about execution. Cocaine Blues celebrates drug-fueled mayhem. The Wall depicts a failed prison escape ending in death. These weren't songs designed to reform criminals. They were songs that acknowledged their reality without judgment. The prisoners responded because Cash treated them like human beings. Not as monsters to be feared or problems to be solved, but as men who had made mistakes and were paying for them. In that cafeteria for 90 minutes, they weren't inmates, they were an audience. Audio engineer Roy Cash, no relation to Johnny, captured the performance using two Ampex 300 portable reel-to-reel tape recorders. The limitations of the equipment forced everyone to get it right in the moment. There were no overdubs, no fixes, no safety nets. What you hear on the album is what happened that day. That authenticity proved more powerful than any studio polish could have been. Listeners could feel they were there, experiencing something raw and unrepeatable. The album didn't sound like other country records of 1968. It sounded like life. At Folsom Prison arrived at a moment when country music desperately needed it. By the late 1960s, Nashville had become obsessed with crossing over to pop markets. The Nashville sound dominated, lush string arrangements, background choruses, production techniques borrowed from pop music. Country was becoming smooth, polished, inoffensive. Artists like Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves had achieved crossover success with this approach. But something essential was being lost. The rawness, the working-class perspective, the willingness to address uncomfortable subjects. At Folsom Prison rejected all of that. It was rough, unpolished, confrontational. It addressed poverty, addiction, violence, and incarceration directly, and it became a massive hit. The album's success gave permission to other artists to return to country's roots. Merle Haggard, himself a former San Quentin inmate, found new validation for his outlaw country approach. Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson would soon launch the outlaw country movement that dominated the 1970s. But Cash's influence extended beyond country music. Bob Dylan called him the spirit of America. U2's Bono said Cash out-rocked all of us. Bruce Springsteen covered Cash songs and cited him as a major influence on albums like Nebraska. The punk and alternative rock movements of the 1970s and 1980s embraced Cash as a spiritual godfather. His willingness to champion unpopular causes, his anti-establishment stance despite mainstream success, his refusal to compromise his vision, these became touchstones for generations of rebels. When Cash died in 2003, his obituary appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Not the art section, the front page. The paper of record recognized that Cash's cultural significance transcended music. He had become an American icon, a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of redemption and second chances. On January 13, 2018, exactly 50 years after the original concert, artists gathered at Folsom State Prison to commemorate the anniversary. The event featured performances by Jamie Johnson, Pat Monahan of Train, and John Carter Cash, Johnny and June's son. They played to an audience of inmates just as Johnny had done 5 decades earlier. The prison itself had changed dramatically. The old mess hall No. 2 where Cash performed no longer existed. Security protocols were far more stringent. The casual access that allowed Cash to meet Glen Sherley backstage would be impossible today. But the need for what Cash represented hadn't diminished. America's prison population had exploded since 1968. When Cash performed at Folsom, the U.S. incarcerated approximately 200,000 people. By 2018, that number had grown to over 2.3 million, the highest incarceration rate in the world. The issues Cash advocated for, rehabilitation over punishment, humane treatment of prisoners, recognition that inmates are human beings deserving of dignity, remained just as relevant, in some ways, more relevant. John Carter Cash reflected on his father's legacy. He felt a kinship with the downtrodden, the imprisoned, and those who had lost their way. At Folsom, he found his voice, not just as an entertainer but as an advocate. The anniversary concert received limited media coverage. It couldn't replicate the cultural moment of 1968. But it demonstrated that the values Cash embodied, compassion, redemption, the belief in second chances, still resonated. The story of At Folsom Prison is ultimately about risk and redemption. Johnny Cash risked everything on that January morning in 1968. His career was dying. His personal life was in shambles. He was barely sober. The prison concert could have been a final humiliation. A has-been country singer performing for captive audiences because no one else would listen. Instead, it became his resurrection. But the album's significance extends beyond Cash's personal comeback. It represented a risk by Columbia Records to support an uncommercial project. A risk by the prison system to allow such intimate access. A risk by the inmates to open their hearts to a performer who could easily have exploited them. Everyone took a chance, and it created something transcendent. The album proved that authenticity matters more than polish, that compassion for society's outcasts isn't weakness but strength, that art can spark social change without sacrificing entertainment value, that redemption is possible even if it's complicated and messy and sometimes ends in tragedy. Glen Sherley's suicide reminds us that not every story has a happy ending, that systemic problems require systemic solutions, that one album, one concert, one gesture of compassion can't fix broken systems or heal all wounds, but it can create a moment of connection. It can give voice to the silenced. It can plant seeds that grow in unexpected ways. 56 years after its release, At Folsom Prison remains powerful because it captured something elemental, a man standing before society's rejected, treating them with dignity, giving them his best performance, seeing their humanity when the rest of the world had written them off. That January morning, inside those granite walls, Johnny Cash didn't just save his career. He created a document of American compassion that continues to challenge and inspire. The comeback that happened behind bars wasn't just about record sales or Grammy nominations or chart positions. It was about remembering that every person, no matter what they've done, no matter where they are, deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated like a human being. That's the real legacy of At Folsom Prison. And that's why, decades later, we're still talking about it. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Johnny Cash's, never stop teaching us.